So we are all set. Okay. Hi everybody. It's a pleasure for me to present today to Ivar R. Hannikainen from the University of Granada. He's part of the philosophers research group in the University of Granada, and he's also a leading world expert in experimental philosophy, experimental psychology, and cognitive sciences. And today he's here in IAS Research to present his latest research in a talk entitled Coordination, Morality, and Law. So please welcome everybody to Mr. Ivar Hannikainen, and when you want.
Okay, thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here. In talking to Mikkel, we decided that I would just provide an overview of a line of research I've been doing on how experimental methods can bring to bear on questions in philosophy. And this particular project is it initiated as a discussion of how, or it originated in a problem that people have alluded to in the philosophy of law, which I know is not a particular interest in this group, but I hope that it resonates with some of the other questions about the origins of normativity and society and so on. So the problem that this set of studies originated in is the question of how morality relates to law. In the 1950s and ever since, there was a kind of ongoing debate about whether morality and law are, intrinsically or closely related, or whether there's some kind of fundamental distinction between morality and law. And what I want to say over the course of a few different studies that I'll be presenting is a bit of a kind of reconciliation of these two ideas. So I'll highlight the ways in which morality and law are very similar, and also the ways in which they're fundamentally different. So in this debate between two legal philosophers, Hart and Fuller, they kind of played around with this thought experiment involving vehicles in a park, and they said, if there's a rule that says no vehicles in the park, how should we understand that? Should we understand that as strictly prohibiting vehicles, or should we interpret that in light of the broader purpose that rule serves? So you might think that the rule has to do with safety, or maybe air pollution, or maybe it's both. But the question that they were debating is, how do we address these borderline issues, both in the manifestation of whether something is a vehicle, or the definition of what counts as a vehicle, and also the extent to which we should draw on broader considerations besides the literal meaning of the rule to decide what constitutes a violation. So they said, we may call, I think this was Hart, the problems which arise outside of the core of standard instances or settled meaning, problems of the penumbra. This presentation will discuss various sorts of problems of the penumbra in the way we apply and enforce rules and norms, not just in the law, but also in everyday life. And I'm going to say three things. One is the core result that we've obtained in a series of studies. The second part will describe what we think is the mechanism, in the cognitive mechanism that explains why we observe the pattern of results that I'll describe in part one. And then the third part of the study is just an exploration of the extent to which this essential tension that I'll be describing between law and morality manifests as interpersonal conflict and not so much, or not strictly interpersonal disagreement. Okay, so the kind of thing that we've done in these studies, sometimes using text-based vignettes, other times more recently using audiovisual animation and other modes of administration, is just describe a series of rules, some of which are legal and some of which are not. So one example might be a rule in a school that prohibits cell phone use in the class. So what Hart and Fuller debate is whether we should understand that, or we should apply that rule strictly by considering the very text of the rule that says no phones in the classroom, or whether in order to apply that rule properly, we need to kind of appeal to the broader purpose that it serves. And in this case, we'll just assume that the purpose is to limit distraction so that the students are able to pay attention and learn. So the view that Hart espoused, we call textualism. It's the idea that you should just apply rules as literally as possible. And the idea that Fuller espoused is what we'll call purposivism, and he advocated that we should at least complement the use of literal meaning with an kind of appreciation and consideration of what the rule's purpose is. So in our studies, you can imagine various sorts of issues of the penumbra where it's not as easy as just, it's not immediately obvious that the behavior violates the rule because it doesn't violate both the text and the purpose of the rule. So we describe the different cases that people are invited to consider as core cases of violation, the easy ones, where the text and the purpose is violated, and then two classes of more difficult cases. The cases that we refer to as over-inclusion, where the text is violated but the purpose is not, and cases that we describe as under-inclusion, where the purpose is violated but the text is not. And then by doing that, we ask how and why people care about each of these two constitutive elements of a rule. For example, in one of these studies, people might learn that classes at a local school were frequently disrupted by students using their phones. We would then tell them to get students to pay attention in class. The headmaster announced that phones may not be used in the classroom. And then we would describe a case. It could be an easy case like this one, a core violation where a student texts friends on his phone instead of paying attention in class. And then we would ask people to make various sorts of judgments. I'm going to be referring, I think, exclusively today at judgments about whether the rule was violated. But we also know stuff about whether people think that the corresponding punishment should be levied against the person and so on. So we've done different things, but I'm going to be talking mostly about people's kind of overall judgments of whether the rule was violated in each case. So this is the basic structure of the stimuli, both in the text-based vignettes and also in the audiovisual stuff that I'm not going to be showing, but this is sort of in the background in everything that I'm going to be describing. Okay, so the first study I'm going to talk about is with my two colleagues in Brazil, Noel Struchiner and Guilherme Almeida. And it follows this basic structure that I've told you about, with the two different hard cases, the over-inclusion and the under-inclusion. And if you think of this as a 2x2 matrix, there's obviously one more condition, which is the condition in which an agent complies with both elements of the rule. So they just do nothing wrong. They just take, for example, copious notes while paying close attention in class. And a final thing before I show you some results is that we are not going to be describing the results. I'm not going to be presenting the results of any specific rule. These studies involve multiple stimuli, so you'll just be looking at the average of of various different rules, such as no phones in the classroom, no shoes in the house, zero tolerance for alcohol, driving laws, unauthorized access to a science lab, no dogs in the restaurant, sleeping at the station, and so on. We've kind of developed a larger stimulus set, and each of these studies combines some number of different rules to form a kind of overarching conclusion. One thing that is in the background is that there hasn't been that much attention to how legal decision-making operates in kind of the broader areas of social psychology, moral psychology, or even developmental psychology. The one thing that we can say is that in kind of literature on moral development, kind of on the left there's this idea in the background that what happens throughout cognitive development is that we kind of cease to follow authority as blindly as we would in what Kohlberg called a pre-conventional stage or a conventional stage, and that as we mature cognitively and socially, we come to see the relevant moral principles behind various rules and apply them selectively if we think the outcome of doing so is right. And as you'll see, what our results show kind of undermines this picture, and I think that's what makes it interesting for studying normativity more broadly. So the basic idea here are the first set of results published in 2020. The basic idea is that when we look at these difficult cases of over-inclusion and under-inclusion, over and over again, with very few exceptions, what we see is that people enforce the letter of the rule more so than its spirit. So, if I say I walked into the classroom and kind of set my phone on the table just what do we say? We say to keep my papers in order, or I check my phone to use the calculator as part of the assignment. That disobeys the rule, even though I'm obviously complying with the purpose. I'm actually doing the exercise in class. So it happens that people consider those types of benevolent transgressions to violate the rule more so than other types of behaviors that actually undermine the purpose behind the rule despite not doing so via transgression of the text. So one example might be that I don't use my phone, but I just type on WhatsApp web while the teacher is speaking. I just chat with my friends, make plans for the weekend. So I'm obviously not paying any attention. I'm violating the purpose of the rule, but I'm doing so in a way that bypasses the text. And people in this particular study consider that to violate the rule only 22% of the time instead of 62% of the time. So that was the initial finding, and what's happened after is that we've seen that is actually quite robust. So shortly after that, we started this cross-cultural study, which we've now also published. So it's not a kind of quirk of this Brazilian data set that we had initially. It seems to be something that more generally holds across various different cultures, both convenience and nationally representative samples. So at one point we ran this in 15 countries, with just under 5,000 participants. And what I'm going to show you on this figure is a visualization of where the 15 countries land on this two-dimensional plot. So what we should think is that the bottom right quadrant is where you should land if you consider that if you're a purposivist, so you think that the purpose matters, the text doesn't. And the green quadrant represents the Hartian textualist position, that you think the text matters and the purpose doesn't. If you thought both things mattered, then you would land on the top right quadrant that's empty or not color coded, and if you thought, you can't violate rules, nothing violates rules, then you would land on the bottom left quadrant. So the question is, where do the 15 countries in the second study land? And this is what it looks like. So many countries are in the textualist quadrant. They're not all. It's not kind of super dramatic. It's not that every single country is up at, you could call that 1-7, the very top left corner. So there's some variation, and there's obviously some tension between the importance of the text and the importance of the purpose. But the overall pattern is that the text really is predominant as kind of the quality that drives judgments of rule violation across 15 different countries in this study. And there, that red dot is just the global mean of those nearly 5,000 participants. Okay, so this is the basic finding that I wanted to tell you about. We see, I didn't emphasize this, but let's go back and say this anyhow. That pattern in which the countries are kind of, leaning towards the textualist quadrant, but not decisively so. One thing that it suggested that there is some degree of recognition among lay people that is a difficult question to answer. If it were an easy question to answer, we would say, like I said, what we would be seeing is much clearer evidence that the national means are up in the top left corner. So I think what we do see in this initial data set is evidence that people have both textualist and purposivist tendencies. They see this as some kind of problem or dilemma. They do seem to be kind of more persuaded by the textualist view that violating a rule is violating its text. And there is some amount of cultural variation in that tendency, as you saw, because the dots were not completely exactly overlapping. There was some kind of dispersion. And one final thing is that judgments of those two cases are negatively correlated, which is, I guess, we could talk about that later, but further evidence that there might be some kind of cultural element to the variation. Okay, so parts 2 and 3, we're just going to try to explain this further, just to try and understand what is behind this tension between the text and the purpose, and I'm going to try to answer that question, as well as this kind of second question of why the text appears to dominate over the spirit in these types of dilemmas. And I hope that'll illuminate some of the differences between law and morality and why we have these distinct sources of normativity in social communities. Okay, so to understand questions of mechanism, to understand why people value the purpose of rules, we actually turned to, in research done with Brian Flanagan at Maynooth University in Ireland, we investigated people's judgments of immoral laws. So we describe laws a little bit like the laws that would have been in place during the Third Reich, and investigate the extent to which moral reasoning actually drives purposivist judgments in the interpretation of rules. To do that, at one point we describe, and I'm sorry that there's been a little complication with the font. I tried to change all of the fonts, but I clearly missed a few. So it's not looking ideal, but I apologize. So one of the scenarios we invited people to consider involves this kind of science-y power plant type scenario. In the benevolent, nuclear power plant, sorry. In the benevolent case, we tell people that at the nuclear power plant, scientists are experimenting with sources of clean energy. The purpose of the rule is to ensure the staff's safety. So to ensure the staff's safety, the director of the power plant creates a rule, okay? And then in a simple violation case, a tech hobbyist gains access into the power plant and just played with the equipment very recklessly. Kind of simple case of violating both the text and the purpose of the rule. Now, for the evil version of the same case, we describe a nuclear power plant where evil scientists are experimenting with human exposure to radiation. And now the purpose of the rule is to keep the project secret. It's not to ensure the staff safety. So to keep the project secret, the director says, creates this rule. Only authorized, lab authorized personnel only. And then a kind of humanitarian journalist gains access into the power plant and exposes the humanitarian crimes. So clear case of violating both the text, the journalist is definitely not authorized to enter the lab, or rather, the power plant, and also violation of the purpose, because the reason that they're going in there is to reveal the project. Okay, so what we see in the comparison between these two types of cases is that everyone unanimously, pretty much, some people don't pay that much attention, but people kind of unanimously recognize that the violating the benevolent rule is a violation, whereas there's a bit of bimodality and actually a significant difference between those two in this core violation type setting, such that people are kind of more torn as to whether the journalist violated the evil rule to keep the power plant operation secret. And you can ask why that is. And one way to ask why that is by separately investigating whether it is violation of the text that differs across the two cases or violation of the purpose that differs across the two cases. And we did that in the study. I'm going to speed up a little bit so we have more time for discussion. Should we finish round 2 or earlier?
Yes, round 2.
So I finish a little before that and then leave time for questions, no? Okay. Whatever is standard. Thank you. Okay, so now we break it up and we say, so is it that violating the text of the rule differs as a function of the valence of the rule, or is it that violating the purpose differs as a function of the valence of the rule? So, for example, we could describe an over-inclusion case where a retired scientist returns to the lab to empty her desk. So she's no longer authorized personnel, she's retired, but she doesn't really constitute a problem for the power plant safety. It hasn't been that long since retirement, so she probably remembers the protocols. So she only violates the text of the rule and not the purpose. And similarly, a fervent supporter of the kind of evil regime of evil scientists visits the lab to applaud the scientists' work. So they're not authorized personnel, they violate the text, but they're fervent supporters, they don't violate the purpose. They're not going to expose the secret plans. And when we look at that, we see that those cases do not differ at all. Cases that merely violate the text of both laws to the same degree. Maybe you anticipated this already, but now we do the same for selectively violating the purpose. So in that condition, you would have a lab technician handling the equipment carelessly. They're a lab technician, so they're authorized personnel, and people know this. If we ask people to answer comprehension questions, they do it right. They know that one thing violates only the text and the other thing violates only the purpose. So a lab technician handles the equipment carelessly, violating the purpose but not the text. And here the lab technician leaks footage of the scientist's cruel acts, similarly violating the purpose but not the letter of the rule. And here's where we see a significant difference, such that it's possible to violate the purpose of a benevolent rule, but it's almost impossible to violate the purpose of an immoral rule. And if we do the stats there, we have this model where we enter text and purpose as crossed factors, as we did in the previous study, and we add a further manipulation, which is the valence of the purpose, and we observe a two-way interaction between violation or compliance with the purpose and the valence of the purpose, but no two-way interaction between valence and text. So that idea. Okay, this is going to take me to my first conclusion about mechanism, which is that when people make purposivist judgments, it's because they're driven to do the morally right thing. I'm just going to leave it at that, and go on to what underlies textualist judgments. See if I can convince you of this sort of tension. Okay, so to ask ourselves what underlies textualist judgments, we borrowed this idea from game theory that the economist Thomas Schelling developed in this book, The Strategy of Conflict, which is the idea of a focal point. Some people call it a Schelling point, so Schelling point or focal point. So the idea of a focal point is, I'm going to try this on Mikkel. Like, Mika and I, we're on the bike lane, and it's a bit narrow, and we don't see each other, and we're just biking towards each other, and we only have a short moment to make a decision about what to do. We don't have enough time to negotiate what it is we're going to do to avoid crashing, so we just have to do something and hope that we both do the same thing. So you want to say what we're each going to do, okay, or what you're going to do, and let's see if we don't crash. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Right. Okay, good. I think we didn't crash. We almost crashed.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the basic idea. In this literature on focal points, Thomas Schelling talks about kind of the establishment of coordination devices that enable people to make collectively optimal decisions in circumstances in which they cannot communicate. This is one of the slides that ended up worst off after I moved it from my laptop to this computer. So you don't see any of the icons, but you can kind of imagine that it's terrible if I swerve left and you swerve right. There are 3 outcomes that are terrible because they involve a crash. There are then 4 further outcomes that involve a near miss. And there are 2 outcomes that are okay. I mean, both can avoid, or both do avoid the crash. But the critical thing about this is that to avoid the crash, we both have to make the same decision, and we depend on that. And there are circumstances in which we cannot achieve that coordinated outcome without by communicating. We have to do so in the absence of communication. And Thomas Schelling made theoretical progress and explaining kind of how focal points arise and the important role that they play in communities. So we borrowed that idea to ask ourselves whether the reason why we favor or we seem to align with textualist reasoning, and I showed you the cross-cultural evidence that seems to be generally true, despite the fact that we also recognize that the morally right thing to do is the very opposite, and to follow the purpose of the rule in cases in which these conflict. So why is it that people adhere to the text of rules instead of their purpose? And we speculated that it would be because the rules text plays this kind of coordinating role, so that it enables, as we see on this slide, 2 judges that might not be able to communicate, or might not know of each other's existence, or might judge similar cases at different points in time, that it would enable those different judges at different points in time to judge legally similar ways, legally similar cases the same way, sorry. And we tested that by running an experiment in which half of the participants were randomly assigned to judge cases like the ones I described before, but under specific instructions. So the instructions said, you are invited to play the judging game, you are judge 1, and you have been paired with another player, judge 2. On the following screens, both of you will be reading the same 8 stories. Each story describes a rule and a person's behavior. After reading each story, you will both be asked to make a decision. Did the person violate the rule, yes or no? To win extra earnings, you and Judge 2 must agree on as many decisions as possible. You must try and reach the same decision on case 1 all the way through case 8 without talking to each other. And then we thought 8 was too cruel because it's quite difficult. So we said if you agree on at least 6 decisions, you make extra money, 1 extra pound. And like I said, people were randomly assigned to either of these 2 conditions. So some people just made the decision in normal circumstances, no specific instructions, just do your thing, decide whether the person violated the rule or not. And the other half of the sample were randomly assigned to this coordination condition where they received the instructions that you just saw. Okay, the rest of the study is the same as what I've been describing before. No evil rules anymore, just decent rules, and text and purpose manipulations that are orthogonal. So this is what we see in the control condition. Now those dots are not countries anymore, now they're scenario pairs. I just wanted to show some of the variation across cases. There are naturally some cases people think are rules that are very strict and therefore, nothing is a violation, and other cases are, so there's just variation from one case to the next. But much like the study I showed you with the cultural variation, the grand mean there is very slightly in the textualist quadrant again. And in the coordination condition, the treatment condition, we see generally shift upward and leftward, so towards greater textualism, towards a greater tendency for people to apply the text instead of the rule, under conditions in which they're instructed to make the same decision as another player with whom they can't communicate. And when we run the corresponding analysis here, we pre-registered that we would not introduce like the easy cases into the analysis. So this is just an analysis comparing both over-inclusion and under-inclusion, the 2 types of difficult cases. And we get the interaction between conditions, so over-inclusion versus case type, which is over-inclusion or under, and condition, which is presence or absence of coordination, instructions, and rewards. Okay, so I think that's a tiny bit of evidence that coordination motives drive people to favor the text of a rule over the purpose. We introduce these coordination, financial incentives on coordination, and that makes people adhere even more closely than they would by default to the text of a rule over its purpose, in conditions in which those 2 kind of interpretive standards would drive opposite decisions. Even though, if it happened to be that they both made a purposivist decision, they would still get the money. That's sort of the thing. Okay, so here's my kind of broad and ambitious claim, is that what the mechanism that underlies this tension between textualism and purposivism in interpretation of rules, and that may be insightful as to the kind of distinction between legal normativity and moral normativity, is that the moral normativity is about making the right decision, but the legal normativity reflects this tension between making the right decision but also making the same decision. There's this sort of lay correlate of that, which is just this idea that like cases should be treated alike under the law. And I think that sort of captures this idea that in legal decision making, legal decision making differs from moral decision making in that it encapsulates a bit of both. People want to make the right decision, but they're also highly motivated to make the same decision as other people in those same circumstances to achieve some kind of legal stability or so. Okay, so finally, if I have a few more minutes, I'll probably just breeze through this because I don't think it really adds too much. I just wanted to show you some of the more recent work in this line of research. And here I've been asking mostly whether the conclusion of this third part we started out by exploring the extent to which this tension between textualism and purposivism is a product of interpersonal disagreement. So some people have the textualist view and other people have the purposivist view. And we get a mix because we have people of one kind and people of the other kind. Or whether it's really that there's a little bit of Hart and a little bit of Fuller in each one of us. And that the kind of reason for that, for the kind of pattern of results we've been getting so far, is that people are individually or intrapersonally conflicted about whether to abide by the text or the rule. So the last part is just about distinguishing the idea of interpersonal disagreement from the idea of intrapersonal conflict and providing evidence for one of those two. And we've done a few things to do that, to test that. So one example is this research we've done I'm just providing a different cover story to not make it all about the power plant or all about the cell phones in class. But another one of our studies applies another one of our scenarios is this kind of no shoes in the house rule. And you can imagine easy cases that either comply with the text and comply with the purpose, provided the purpose is to keep the floors clean, or they violate both the text and the purpose because they're shoes and they're also dirty. And then we have kind of the experimental conditions where you violate the text and comply with the purpose or vice versa. So one thing that we've done is to investigate how individual participants reason about each of these cases. So this is sort of paraphrasing what I just said. The prediction of the disagreement view would be that, the reason why we get 2/3 textualism is because there was one participant who was purposivist and another two who were textualist. So the participants 1 and 3 go through and make consistently textualist judgments in these cases, and participant 2 goes through and makes consistently purposivist judgments in these cases. And the conflict prediction is that those judgments will not be consistent within each participant. That when we ask people to judge these types of cases, one time they will make a purposivist judgment, and on the next trial they might make a textualist judgment instead. And by the end of the study, what we're seeing is that each individual person was sort of compelled or torn between honoring both. Does anyone have a prediction about which of these two ideas is correct?
The result of the test, you mean?
Yeah. It's a difficult one. Okay, so the good thing no one said anything because the results weren't going to show up quite yet. But, okay, so to analyze this, we stipulated that If the disagreement prediction is right, in this multiple regression with text and purpose as predictors, either the x or y should be 0, so one of the two coefficients should be 0, and according to the conflict prediction, both coefficients should be positive. So if we ask people to make multiple judgments, that either, according to the disagreement, only one of the two coefficients will be significant, and only one of them will be significant and the other one will be non-different from 0. And according to the conflict view, both coefficients should be positive. We sort of visualize that. And now we have two studies that test that. One is with a convenience sample and the other is with a nationally representative sample, in which each person makes between 20 and 40, judges 20 to 40 cases. So enough to understand whether they're sensitive to the text, the purpose, or both. Okay, so we get a bit of a mixture. We get a bit of both, but it isn't so much both. It's really that most people show some kind of sensitivity to both the text and the purpose, and only a few people seem to be kind of consistently theoretically aligned with one of the two kind of ideas. Okay, the last way that we've shown this is by looking at people's reaction times. So the results of the previous study are suggestive of conflict because people are making judgments in line with textualism sometimes and in line with purposivism other times. But a further piece of evidence could be that when those two standards are inclined, it also takes me longer to decide what I want to do. And we've done that just by adopting some of the methods that people use in cognitive psychology to analyze choice and reaction time data, like the Stroop task, where in easy cases where the color matches the word, it's easy to say the color that the word is printed in. But then when the color doesn't match the word, it becomes more difficult to say the color that the word is printed in. Plausibly because the word that is printed out conflicts with your ability to name the color. And thus people make more mistakes, but critically they also take longer. And so we've been doing a lot of work on reaction times with Nila Engelman, a collaborator at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. And I'll just show you the results of this really quick. Does this work? Oh yeah, so, oh no, this is a bit silly, but it's just a display of what it looks like. So you're presented with a rule. You have a little bit of time to kind of see what the rule is and what the purpose is. And then, you read the sentence in bold and make a decision. The reason that it's passing is because I just made a video of myself, but you could take almost as long as you want. I think there was a limit of 10 seconds or so. And the rest of the stimuli is the same, so it's just the middle sentence that you have to pay attention to and press one of the keys on the keyboard to indicate your decision. Okay, when is this over? Not yet. That's enough. I think we get it. Okay. Okay, so this is just some Stroop data. When the color and the word are congruent, people almost always get it right. And they at least sometimes make mistakes and take 200 extra milliseconds when they're incongruent. Now you can wonder whether you get the same thing with rules in which the text and the purpose provide opposing recommendations. In the congruent cases, we see high accuracy, and people take about 2,300 milliseconds to decide on average. The reason that the histogram below the clean feet is downward is because most responses are no. no, the person didn't violate the rule. And then the other histogram in the bottom right, where the dirty shoes were, is upward because most of the responses were yes. And so the question is, do people experience cognitive conflict when judging these two more difficult cases? And they do. So somewhere between 400 or 700 milliseconds longer, even when they've done like dozens of trials and they've already made up their mind as to, we do get learning effects, so people become more textualist as they do this, which is also something we're exploring. But we see cognitive conflict not only in the fact that people are sensitive to both text and purpose, which I showed you earlier with the bi-participant regressions, but also in their reaction times they exhibit signs of conflict between both. So people require more time to decide incongruent or conflict cases and waver between textualist and purposivist standards. Now I'm going to stop because we've been going for a while, but I'm just going to show you some silly recent developments. I want to leave time for questions, but the thing we're doing now is just kind of further consolidating this using, we designed a web-based study where we track mouse trajectories on the screen. And you can think of the curvature between the two response options as also an indication of conflict. So, this is what it looks like in this version of the study is that let's see. It doesn't look like this anymore, but it's this basic idea, right? So you see the thing, and then you can imagine that there are circumstances in which you're conflicted, and that'll show up as greater curvature because you initiate your trajectory towards one response and then move toward the other. So this is the basic idea, and the individual trajectories are all out of control. But then if you aggregate them, you get kind of clear stuff. This is the congruent cases, the amount of curvature you get for that when you normalize them and kind of create a single mean trajectory. And the incongruent cases displayed by the solid lines, as you can see, those show more curvature than the control case. Both when the answer is yes, the person violated the rule, and also when the answer is no, the person didn't violate the rule. And we've done stats on that, both mean absolute deviation and area under the curve, just two different measures of conflict, and we get evidence that the trajectories are more curved in these conflicting cases. Okay, so you remember what the core finding was? That there's tension between purpose and text, with text prevailing a little bit over purpose. I argued that the mechanism behind that could reflect tension between the desire to do the morally right thing and the desire to make the same decision as other or interpret rules in the same way to achieve coordination within communities. And the last part was just a little exploration showing that it's not that some people want the morality and other people want the coordination. It seems to be that most of us want to do both. And just on a broader level, I think that like this fact about law kind of imposing this additional constraint on morality, I think suggests to me that legal decision making has been kind of underexplored and as an independent source of normativity, and maybe in part because we've always kind of operated, maybe especially in moral psychology, with this assumption that if you develop cognitively, you'll do morality. That's what matters. Rules are kind of this inferior thing, probably not very interesting. And my own opinion has been changing on that, even though I was very much of that opinion a few years ago. And now I'm starting to think that there's something theoretically interesting about legal normativity and how it complements kind of moral normativity as kind of complementary rule books in governing social conduct. Okay, well, that's all. I'm sorry I took the entire hour. I hope we still have a few minutes to chat. And I really want to thank the 9 people who are listed there who have worked on this with me, and also a generous grant from the Spanish Ministry of Science and Innovation from 2023, the Research Consolidation Award. And that's it. I look forward to discussing with you, and thanks for having me again.